Hey guys, imagine you're trudging through a mud-slick Roman street at dawn, the scent of fresh triumphal arches clashing with the rank stink of latrine overflow, and a legionary's boot thuds like a bass drum against your anxiety. Yeah, it's a bit gritty, but that's the vibe we're rolling into today. So smash that like button if you love a little ancient chaos, and drop a comment telling us which modern empire you think is crumbling faster than a Netflix subscription in a blackout. Before we dive, dim the lights, grab a coffee or a goblet of whatever keeps you sane, and get comfy because you'll soon be watching the rise of Rome like binge, watching a city-building game set to hardcore. Picture yourself as a Roman senator sipping watered-down wine while hearing gossip about Caesar's latest scandal. Feel the chill of marble, hear the echo of sand-filled sandals, and notice how the empire's swagger smelled suspiciously like hubris mixed with cheap perfume. Ever wonder why a civilization that could engineer aqueducts still failed to fix its traffic jam of corruption? We'll break down the brutal math of legions, politics, and a budget that would make your college student loans blush, all while throwing in a few sarcastic memes about when your empire hits 404. Stay tuned because the collapse isn't just history. It's a cautionary Netflix binge of power, pride, and a really bad PR team. The cobblestones of early Rome rumbled under the clatter of chariots and market stalls, and twin siblings Lucius and Aelia weaved through the chaos like mischievous sprites. The air smelled of fresh basil, roasting pork, and a pinch of horse sweat, a perfume that whispered of ambition and survival. Children shouted games of tag while senators in togas haggled over olives, their voices rising above the clamor like a chorus of ancient rap battles. Lucius, ever the curious boy, slapped a stray fig off his father's shoulder, only to watch it splatter onto a marble step, a sticky reminder that greatness often starts messy. Aelia giggled at the spectacle, secretly noting that Rome's future might be as bright as the sun-baked dust on the Forum. In a cramped basilica, an old rhetorician taught the twins the sacred tenets of Roman law, his voice cutting through incense smoke like a gladiator's sword. He painted Lex as a shield, solid, impartial, and as sturdy as the stone columns that lined the Senate house. Lucius felt the weight of the wax tablets in his palm, each etched word a promise that citizens could call out injustice louder than a crowd at the Circus Maximus. Aelia, meanwhile, imagined the law as a game of chess, each decree a strategic move that could checkmate a corrupt noble or protect a humble baker. The twins left with their heads buzzing, knowing that Rome's power rose on the back of written rules as much as on iron sandals. Soon the twins heard the rhythmic thump of legionary march drums echoing from the Campidoglio hills, a sound that made the city's heart pound faster. Soldiers drilled in tight formations, their sandals striking the ground in perfect unison, while sweat and leather mingled with the sour tang of river water. Lucius watched a centurion splice his spear through a wooden dummy, the crack echoing like a thunderclap across the Forum, and felt a surge of awe at the discipline that forged an empire. Aelia, ever the skeptic, teased that the soldiers probably smelled like a mix of ash and fear, yet admired how each step was a promise to protect the Republic's borders. The twins realized that Rome's might depended not just on laws, but on the iron will of men who marched like the tide, relentless, unstoppable. One evening, under a sky bruised purple by sunset, a charismatic stranger strode into the market, his cloak shimmering like a Hollywood superhero's cape, Julius Caesar, the man who would rewrite history. He chatted with bakers, tossed coins, and spoke of conquest with a grin wider than the Tiber River, his words dripping with ambition and a hint of danger. Lucius felt a chill as Caesar pointed toward the distant Gaul, promising glory, while Aelia caught the scent of ambition, sharp, metallic, and oddly intoxicating. The twins glanced at each other, realizing they were witnessing the birth of a legend who would turn the Republic's modest house into a sprawling empire, complete with triumphal arches and endless intrigue. Caesar's laughter rang out, echoing off marble and mud alike, a reminder that power often wears a smile before it bites. As night settled and the twins trudged home, the distant roar of a distant battlefield mingled with the clink of wine cups in a tavern, creating a symphony of triumph and terror. The city's lights flickered like fireflies trapped in glass, each lantern a tiny beacon of the new order being forged. Lucius pressed his hand to his chest, feeling the pulse of Rome, a mix of hope, hunger, and the ever-present scent of fresh mud after rain. Aelia, humming a lullaby her mother sang, imagined the empire's future as a towering colossus, built on law, steel, and the daring dreams of men like Caesar. Together they fell asleep, dreaming of the foundations they'd helped lay, unaware that those very stones would someday crack under the weight of their own grandeur. The twins, now tall enough to command a decent amount of grain, set out on the Via Appia with a sack of figs and a head full of curiosity. They marched past rolling vineyards that smelled of crushed grapes and sun-baked stone, feeling the thrum of soldiers' boots like a bass drum under a Roman rave. As milestones slipped by, they shouted greetings to distant towns, their voices echoing off limestone arches that had witnessed more gossip than a modern celebrity Instagram feed. Every tavern they entered offered a swirl of spiced wine, the pungent tang of garum, fermented fish sauce, licking their throats and reminding them that luxury and filth often share a table. Yet even as they marveled at the empire's glitter, a faint sigh drifted from the hills, a whisper that the road they traveled was stretched thin, like a toga's hem about to rip. At the empire's heart, the Pax Romana pulsed like a perfectly timed drum solo, keeping wars at bay while commerce boomed across continents. The twins stood beneath the Colosseum's shadow, hearing the roar of crowds and the clatter of sandals as gladiators prepared for a bout that felt part sport, part reality TV showdown. Marble statues glittered with the sweat of sculptors, their surfaces cool to the touch, yet somehow exhaling the faint scent of fresh limestone mixed with city soot. Aqueducts arced overhead like giant stone ribs, delivering crisp, chilly water that tasted of mountain snow, proof that Roman engineers could build pipelines better than any modern plumber. Even the forum buzzed with philosophers debating virtue, while merchants hawked silk, and the twins could not help but think that the empire's swagger was a selfie stick pointing straight to the heavens. Yet beyond the bustling capital, the empire's far-flung provinces groaned under the weight of endless paperwork and dusty tax collectors. In Gaul, the twins watched a courier stumble through mud, his satchel spilling olive oil that slicked the road and left a pungent, buttery trail for horses to slip on. In Egypt, the Nile's fertile banks sang a lullaby of abundance, but Roman officials demanded grain quotas that left locals clutching empty baskets and muttering curses louder than a barbershop quartet. The soldiers stationed at distant forts complained that their helmets smelled of sweat and burnt leather, a scent that reminded them they were far from any familiar Roman bathhouse. As the twins trekked from province to province, they sensed a growing friction, like a massive toga caught on a thorny bush, straining the empire's once smooth fabric. Back in Rome, the Senate transformed into a theater of whispers, where politicians tangled their togas tighter than a plot twist in a binge-watch drama. Flavius, a senator with a penchant for dramatic hand gestures, accused his rival of siphoning funds for a private chariot race, prompting a chorus of coughs that sounded suspiciously like applause. Behind marble columns, secret meetings brewed like a stew of ambition, where allies swapped favors over goblets of cheap wine that tasted of iron and regret. The twins overheard a conspiratorial laugh. "If we can't fix the empire, at least we can fix the buffet," a grim joke that underscored how politics had become a dinner party gone terribly wrong. The air grew thick with incense and intrigue, and even the statues seemed to line in, as if the gods themselves were scrolling through a scroll of scandals. Despite the undercurrents of decay, the empire still wore its crown like a proud heavyweight champion, dazzling the world with triumphs that glittered brighter than a meteor shower. The twins, now seasoned travelers, felt the paradox of standing on the pinnacle while the foundations trembled beneath their feet. They watched children play with miniature soldier figurines, their laughter echoing off walls that had heard the clash of swords and the sighs of weary generals. In that moment, the twins understood that the zenith of Rome was both a summit and a precipice, a place where success and hubris danced a dangerous tango. With a final glance at the sun setting over the city's rooftops, they whispered that every empire, no matter how glorious, eventually needs a good night's sleep or a dramatic plot twist. The Danube roared like an angry freight train, its icy foam lapping at the battered forts that dotted the empire's northern edge. From the forest shadows emerged the Goths, their banners fluttering like rebellious street art, led by the charismatic chieftain Alaric, whose eyes glittered with ambition and a dash of Netflix-style anti-hero swagger. Roman sentries, gaunt from months without fresh rations, watched the barbarians inch forward, their spears clinking against the cold stone in a rhythm that sounded like a bad drum solo. Every night the campfires sputtered, casting ghostly silhouettes that seemed to whisper, "We're about to be history's footnote." Yet the empire's glory still echoed in the distant marble halls, a stubborn ringtone that refused to be silenced. Back in Rome, the treasury sang a mournful dirge. Coins fell through the cracks like sand through an hourglass, and the once thick gold walls now smelled faintly of mildew and overdue taxes. Marcus, the aging magister militum, stared at the empty ledger and felt his stomach churn louder than the legionary marching drums. He summoned the dwindling legions, a ragtag crew whose armor was pocked with rust and whose sandals squeaked on the marble, as if the gods themselves were slipping on banana peels. "We have no gold, but we have grit," he declared, waving a cracked shield that rattled like a cheap prop. The troops answered with a half-hearted cheer that sounded suspiciously like a disgruntled cat. In the Senate, Lucius paced between marble columns, his toga swaying like a flag caught in a bureaucratic breeze. Senators argued over reforms with the fervor of online gamers debating patch notes. Some wanted to cut the grain subsidies. Others clung to tradition as if it were a vintage vinyl record. The air was thick with the scent of stale wine and sweaty ambition, each puff of incense trying to mask the underlying rot. Lucius, ever the mediator, tried to balance the scales, tossing out jokes about rebooting Rome that fell flat like an ancient meme. Still, he sensed the underlying irony. A civilization that could build aqueducts now needed a better Wi-Fi signal. The first clash on the Danube banks erupted with a thunder of steel, the clash of swords echoing like a rock concert gone horribly wrong. Blood sprayed onto the muddy banks, mingling with the river's earthy perfume, while Alaric's war cries cut through the smoke like a rap battle freestyle. Marcus' legions, half-starved and half-sleepy, fought with a desperation that made their shields wobble like jittery smartphones. The sky turned a bruised violet, and a sudden rain hammered the battlefield, washing away the grime but leaving the stench of burnt leather and fear. In that chaotic tableau, even the river seemed to sigh, as if it, too, had heard the Empire's muffled heartbeat. As the dust settled, the survivors, both Roman and barbarian, lingered amidst broken standards and smeared graffiti that read, "We came, we saw, we ordered takeout." The Senate, now looking like a disgruntled cast of a reality TV show, voted for a last-ditch tax on goat cheese, an idea as half-baked as a midnight pizza. Lucius watched Alaric ride off, his horse kicking up frothy foam, and thought perhaps Rome's true downfall was not the swords but the spreadsheets. The empire's once shimmering mosaics now lay cracked, reflecting the dim glow of torches that flickered like the final credits of a long-running series. And somewhere beyond the ruins, a child would later whisper, "Remember the Empire. It was like the original Game of Thrones, except with more sandals." The twins Marcus and Lucilla stood on a cracked marble balcony as the Visigoths thundered through the city gates of Rome in 410 AD. The sky smelled of ash and sweat, and the distant clang of swords sounded like a broken record stuck on the worst track. They watched the Empire's heart, the Forum, bleed out its marble veins under the weight of barbarian boots. Even the pigeons seemed to mutter, "We came, we saw, we got roasted." The twins' eyes widened, realizing the golden age they had idolized was suddenly a Netflix-style plot twist. Back in the provinces, rival generals turned the countryside into a reality TV showdown called Civil War, Roman Edition. Legions clashed over stale hardtack, while drunken legionaries sang off key verses of "I'm a Little Teutonic." The air reeked of spilled wine, burnt flesh, and the occasional whiff of fresh Roman sewage, nothing like the scented oils of the baths. Iron helmets ricocheted like frisbees, and every shouted command was punctuated by the squeak of sandal straps on cobblestones. The irony was palpable. Rome, once the ultimate peacekeeper, now resembled a chaotic family dinner where everyone fought over the last slice of garum-flavored pizza. As the central authority sputtered like a dying furnace, provincial governors hoarded grain, gold, and gossip like modern influencers hoarding followers. The Senate, once a marble-clad think tank, now resembled a dusty tavern where senators huddled over cheap wine, debating whether to tax the goats or the gold. Soldiers stationed at distant borders stared at the horizon, hearing the distant howl of wolves and the nearer whisper of mutiny. The empire's veins, once pulsing with disciplined order, now throbbed irregularly, each pulse a reminder that the "all roads lead to Rome" slogan had turned into a GPS error. Even the aqueducts seemed to sigh, dripping drips of disillusionment into the streets below. In a desperate bid to stitch the torn tapestry, the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, yes, the guy with the name of the city's mythical founder, summoned the legions for one final march. He rode a trembling horse, his cape flapping like a tattered banner, shouting, "For glory, for Rome," while the troops muttered under their breath, "Is this a meme or a miracle?" The battlefield smelled of rusted metal and terrified horses, and the sky opened up with rain that turned the ground into a slippery slime pit. The legions, half-hearted and half-starved, faltered. Their swords clanged uselessly against the solid wall of disintegrating morale, and the emperor's rally cry fizzled like a dying fireworks display. The final collapse hit like a catapult-launched soufflé, soft at first, then disastrously messy. Rome's streets became a collage of broken columns, abandoned statues, and the lingering odor of smoked fish from street vendors who had lost their customers. The twins, now older and dustier, walked away with a sarcastic grin, remarking that the empire had gone from "all roads lead to glory" to "all roads lead to, well, nothing, really." Their story spread like a viral meme, reminding future generations that even the mightiest empires can be undone by a bad script and a lot of flat-out chaos. As the sun set over the ruined horizon, the echo of distant drums sounded less like triumph and more like a cosmic joke. The universe had just hit reset. The sun drummed a tired lullaby over the cracked terracotta roofs of the old forum, painting everything in a bruise-purple glow. Lucius, his beard tangled like a veteran's battle banner, leaned on a cracked column, while Aelia, eyes still bright as a fresh scroll, brushed dust from her satchel of memories. They could hear the distant clatter of a market vendor hawking garum-scented fish, the scent of sweat and stale cheese riding the breeze like an unwelcome guest. In that amber hush, the two elders swapped stories as if passing a flaming torch, each word sparking against the night's cold. Their laughter cracked the silence, a sound as unexpected as a Roman legion using a selfie stick to point at the ruins. Rome, they said, built roads to the ends of the world, and then built a highway straight to its own ego. Lucius recalled the first time the empire stretched beyond the Alps, soldiers marching like ants under a giant's boot, the clang of metal echoing over sun-baked plains. Aelia chuckled, recalling the emperor who wanted a wall so tall that even the gods would need a ladder to climb over, a hubristic folly that smelled of fresh marble and burnt ambition. They could still taste the iron-rich blood of conquered Gauls mixed with the sweet perfume of triumph, a heady cocktail that made the Senate feel invincible. Yet, like a teenager bragging about a new video game console, Rome bragged too loudly, and the echo eventually bounced back with a crash. Inside the marble corridors, corruption seeped like rain through cracked tiles, officials swapping loyalty for bribes as if exchanging Pokémon cards. Aelia remembered the Senate's endless debates, the clang of silver spoons against goblets louder than any battle cry, while soldiers grew thin as parchment from unpaid wages. The smell of rotting figs in the gardens of power mingled with the sour sweat of exhausted legionaries, a perfume that could curdle even the most stoic centurion's resolve. Lucius shivered as he pictured the once proud legions marching in tatters, their standards drooping like wilted wheat, the eagle's feather dulled by dust. It was as if the empire had caught a case of indigestion, gulping too much, burping out an endless chorus of sighs. When the Goths knocked on the city gates, they sounded less like polite dinner guests and more like a rock band crashing a quiet library, drums of hooves thundering against the cobblestones. The fire that swallowed the forum crackled like a giant's campfire, filling the night air with the acrid perfume of burnt scrolls and melted bronze. Aelia could still hear the wailing of the Vestal virgins, their prayers turning into squeaky whistles as the temple roofs collapsed, a choir of chaos that made even the marble statues weep. Lucius watched the Senate's bronze doors fling open, the marble steps swallowing dust like a giant's mouth, as the Empire's last breath escaped in a sigh that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage. The city fell with a dramatic flair worthy of a Netflix series finale, but without the convenient cliffhanger, just the cold, hard reality of empty streets and stray dogs feasting on triumph's leftovers. From the ashes rose modest wooden huts, their smoky windows flickering like the first emojis of a new civilization. Aelia, now an elder with a crown of wild rosemary, taught children to read by tracing the faded letters on ancient stones, each rune a breadcrumb toward a different future. Lucius laughed, noting that the new lords wore chainmail that clanked like a bad drum line, yet they sang hymns of hope louder than any imperial anthem. The world smelled of fresh loam and damp wool, a stark contrast to the stale perfume of imperial bureaucracy, reminding everyone that progress sometimes smells like wet socks. And as the evening stars blinked like distant stage lights, the couple smiled, realizing that Rome's downfall was not an end but the opening act of a medieval saga, complete with dragons, quests, and occasional Wi-Fi-less buffering. In the waning years of the 4th century, Rome glittered like a freshly polished chariot wheel under a relentless sun. Senator Lucius strutted through the forum, his toga a cascade of white, while General Marcus, armor still smelling of leather and sweat, marched beside a young merchant whose satchel jingled with exotic spices. The air throbbed with the clamor of triumphal arches, the distant roar of a crowd cheering a recent victory against the Goths, and the sweet aroma of roasted dormice wafting from street stalls. Even the marble statues seemed to wink, catching the light as if they, too, were waiting for a grand encore. Yet beneath the fanfare, a thin ribbon of anxiety fluttered, unnoticed by most, like a moth trapped in the golden glow. The city's heart beat in rhythmic drums, the cadence of chariots rattling over cobblestones echoing like a bass line in a Roman techno mix. Patricians lounged in the colonnades, sipping fermented grape juice that tasted like honeyed ambrosia, while vendors shouted about silk from the east, their voices as sharp as a gladius. A troupe of actors performed a comedy about a mighty eagle that mistook a pigeon for a dragon, eliciting laughter that ricocheted off the Senate's stone walls. Children chased runaway frogs in the imperial gardens, their squeals mixing with the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, forging swords destined for distant frontiers. All the while, the sun baked the marble to a scorching warmth that made the stone sweat, reminding even the most jubilant citizen that glory could be a sweaty, sticky business. Yet in the shadowed alleys, whispers curled like incense smoke, speaking of a treasury emptied faster than a tavern after a legion's payday. Tax collectors prowled the markets, their ledgers thudding like war drums, demanding tributes from merchants who already smelled of cumin and desperation. Corruption seeped through the marble veins of the Senate, with senators swapping favors like Pokémon cards, each trade a silent betrayal of the people they swore to protect. Beyond the city's fortified walls, restless barbarians, Huns with eyes like storm clouds and Goths with battle-laced tattoos, drummed their feet on the frontier, the sound a low growl that rattled the Empire's spine. Even General Marcus felt a chill as he inspected the newly raised legions. The soldiers' armor clanged, but their morale creaked like an old wooden bridge under too much weight. The golden eagle on the legion's standard gleamed, its feathers painted brighter than a celebrity's Instagram filter, yet its shadow fell long and dark across the marble plaza. People joked that the eagle could see everything except the growing pile of unpaid debts stacked in the treasury, a pile that smelled faintly of mildew and broken promises. Lucius tried to mask the gloom with grand speeches, his voice booming like a theater trailer, promising triumphs that felt as hollow as a Roman amphora left empty. Meanwhile, Marcus conducted drills that sounded more like a rock concert, shields crashing, swords clanging, trying to drown out the mutters of discontent rising from the crowds. Even the merchant, who once bragged about importing silks, now haggled over the price of cheap barley, his eyes darting like a cat in a room full of roosters. All these threads wove a tapestry that glittered on the surface, but was stitched with frayed, rust-bitten fibers ready to snap. The city's night air grew heavy with the scent of burnt wood and wet stone, as if Rome itself were holding its breath before a massive sneeze. Lucius Marcus and the merchant stood on the Capitoline Hill, staring at the same eagle banner, each wondering whether the next sunrise would bring another triumph or the first rumble of an empire's collapse. In that moment, the crowd's cheers turned into a low hum, like the distant rumble of a Netflix series ending with a cliffhanger, promising more drama, but not the happy ending everyone hoped for. And so, the golden eagle continued to soar, its wings beating against an unseen storm that whispered, "This is just the beginning of the fall." The Danube roared like a massive, damp pipe organ, its mist curling over the ragged forts that kept watch over the restless north. From the opposite bank, Alaric's tribes gathered, their banners fluttering like angry birds on a wind-swept Instagram feed. The scent of smoke and river mud rose, mixing with the clatter of spears and the low, guttural war chants that rattled the stones. Even the river's current seemed to shake its head at the approaching storm, whispering, "Not again, Romans." Shadows stretched long across the water, as if the empire itself were slipping into night. Back in the marble-lined streets of Rome, the imperial treasury coughed up a feeble sigh, its coffers as empty as a politician's promise after an election. Marcus, the hard-bitten commander with sand in his boots, stared at the dwindling legions, their armor dulled by neglect and the smell of stale vinegar from their stale rations. He could hear the clink of coins falling into the abyss of debt, a sound that rivaled the clank of swords on the frontier. "We can't buy courage," he muttered, remembering his father's advice that a soldier fights best when his belly is full, not when his purse is empty. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Rome's power was now measured in how little it could afford to feed its own men. Determined not to let the empire crumble like an overcooked lasagna, Marcus rallied his ragtag troops with a speech that mixed stoic resolve and a dash of Hollywood bravado. He promised them glory, a chance to be remembered like the heroes of old. Think Gladiator meets Lord of the Rings, but with fewer elves and more sand. The soldiers felt the heat of the sun on their helmets, the sweat trickling down like rivulets of doubt, yet they tightened their grip on rusted gladii. As the wind howled, Marcus shouted, "We will stand, or we will die as legends, preferably the standing kind." The ground trembled under marching feet, a drumbeat that seemed to echo the Danube's own angry rhythm. Meanwhile in the Senate, Lucius paced between marble columns, his toga fluttering like a flag at a political rally. The chamber smelled of old parchment, incense, and the faint perfume of power players who just finished a lavish banquet, roasted pheasant, and enough wine to drown a legion. Senators argued over reform versus tradition, some championing fiscal austerity while others clung to the old ways like toddlers to their blankies. Lucius quipped, "If the empire were a smartphone, we'd be stuck on a cracked screen with no software updates," earning a reluctant chuckle that cut through the tension like a sword through parchment. The debate swirled, a storm of rhetoric that left the future of Rome hanging by a thread as thin as a moth's wing. As night fell, shadows stretched over the frontier like a curtain drawn across a theater, and the distant clang of Alaric's war drums grew louder. Marcus stood atop the crumbling wall, feeling the cold stone bite his fingertips, while the smell of river mud and burnt timber filled his nostrils. Lucius, back in Rome, watched the Senate's candle flicker, aware that every decision now felt like a last-minute cheat code in a dying video game. The Empire's once bright banners sagged, their colors bleeding into the twilight, a visual metaphor for a civilization slipping into ruin. In that grim tableau, both men sensed the same truth. The western sun was setting, and the shadows on the frontier were not just on the Danube, they were already creeping into the heart of Rome itself. In the marble corridors of the Senate, whispers turned into shouting matches as two self-styled emperors strutted their claims like peacocks in a fashion show. One wore a laurel wreath, the other a battered military cloak, each promising Rome a fresh start while the crowd munched on stale figs. The air smelled of sweat, ink, and a hint of mildew from ancient scrolls that no one bothered to dust. Guards muttered about politics as a sport, while the emperor's pets, 3 disgruntled cats, plotted their own power grabs. Everyone knew the empire was less a well-oiled machine and more a squeaky Lego set on a shaky table. Meanwhile, the grain shipments from Egypt arrived as thin as gossip, and the city's pantry shelves sagged under the weight of empty promises. Citizens trudged through the forum, stomachs growling louder than the market criers, while the smell of sour porridge clung to their coats like a bad perfume. Children scratched at rusted water fountains, hoping for a sip of something other than the metallic tang of desperation. Rumors spread that the Senate's emergency kitchens served nothing but boiled cabbage and existential dread. Even the pigeons seemed to mock the famine, cooing about their all-you-can-eat buffet of dumpster delights. Into this mess rode Alaric's envoys, slick helmets gleaming like freshly polished gaming consoles, demanding tribute as if they were ordering a Netflix subscription for the empire. Their messenger, a gaunt man with a scar shaped like a lightning bolt, slipped a vellum scroll onto the consul's desk with a thud that sounded suspiciously like a dropped pizza box. The scroll listed gold, grain, and the occasional goat, basically a medieval version of pay-per-view content. Citizens laughed nervously, picturing a barbarian band begging for a Spotify premium account, while the Senate's scribes furiously tried to calculate how much cheese they could spare. The irony was as thick as the ash that now covered the once proud basilicas. Back in Rome, the cracks that had been widening for centuries finally gave a sigh of relief, or perhaps a groan, when the aqueduct sputtered out like an old vinyl record skipping. The streets ran with mud and the smell of rotting fruit, a scent so potent it could wake the dead, or at least the city's overworked corpses in their stone coffins. Merchants sold authentic Roman dust as souvenirs, while the patricians whispered about the good old days over wine that tasted like diluted grape juice. Humor turned bitter when a street poet declared, "We've got more drama than a reality TV show, but none of the paychecks." The city's morale, already on a roller coaster with no safety harness, began to wobble like a drunken juggler on a tightrope. All these messes set the stage for a showdown that would make a blockbuster finale look like a kiddie playground. Alaric's warriors gathered at the city gates, drums beating like an overexcited heart monitor, while the Roman legions polished their swords, more for show than for actual combat. The night air crackled with electricity, not the kind that powers phones, but the raw, static scent of fear and incense from desperate prayers. As the first arrow sliced through the moonlit sky, a lone vendor shouted, "Buy one, get one free," a last-ditch joke that fell flat in the face of looming doom. The empire's fate hung by a thread thinner than a spider's silk, and everyone knew the curtain was about to fall on this grand, crumbling theater. The year was 410 CE, and the Tiber sang a dirge as heavy clouds bruised the sky above the eternal city. Alaric's Visigothic hosts swarmed like a restless soundtrack from a Netflix binge, war drums, clanking armor, and the scent of mud-caked boots. Rome's ancient walls, once as proud as a Roman legion's honor badge, now sagged under neglect, their stones whispering of years spent more on marble statues than on mortar repairs. Citizens peered from crumbling balconies, their faces a mix of awe and dread, as the distant thunder sounded suspiciously like the march of an invading playlist. In that moment, the city's glory flickered like an old TV set about to lose signal. When the gates finally gave way, a crack echoed like a breaking violin string, and Alaric's men flooded the streets with the gusto of a Black Friday crowd chasing discounts. They ripped through bazaars, scattering piles of olives, figs, and spilled wine that sprayed across cobblestones, painting the alleys with a pungent perfume of rot and fermented grapes. Lanterns sputtered, casting jittery shadows over marble statues whose faces were now smeared with grime, and the occasional graffiti that read, "Graffiti is the new marble." Brass cymbals of temple doors clanged as they were forced open, and the mournful chorus of weeping mothers mixed with the guttural laughter of loot-hungry warriors. The very air felt thick, a stew of incense, sweat, and the metallic tang of fresh blood that turned the night's chill into a nauseating furnace. Amid the chaos, General Marcus, a veteran of countless sieges, rallied his dwindling cohort like an old-school coach shouting at a losing high school team. He brandished his gladius, its blade catching the flickering torchlight, and shouted orders that cut through the din like a well-timed meme, sharp, unexpected, and oddly relatable. The soldiers formed a shaky phalanx, shields interlocking, while the ground beneath them vibrated from the march of heavy boots and the occasional cart rolling over broken mosaics. Marcus's voice, hoarse from years of shouting over battlefields, rose above the clamor. "Hold the line, lest Rome become just another episode of Game of Thrones, but without the dragons." Yet even his boldness could not stop the tide. The Visigoths pushed forward, their momentum as relentless as a streaming service's autoplay feature. High on the Palatine, Senator Lucius watched the pandemonium unfold, his toga rustling like an ancient scroll caught in a gust. He clutched a silver goblet, the last remnants of a banquet that now seemed absurdly festive in the face of ruin, and felt his stomach churn with a mix of bile and bitter wine. The sight of temple columns toppled like overcooked spaghetti struck him as the ultimate irony. Rome, the city that built empires, now reduced to a backstage set for a tragic comedy. Lucius whispered to himself, "We built roads that spanned continents, yet we can't even keep the doors shut on a bunch of angry hikers." His heart pounded with the awareness that betrayal had been baked into the very foundations of the empire, and neglect was the yeast that made it rise and fall in one swift, disastrous loaf. When the sun finally crept over the shattered skyline, it illuminated a city that resembled a post-apocalyptic film set, charred banners fluttering like sad confetti, mosaics cracked like old smartphone screens, and the distant echo of distant horns that sounded oddly like a modern-day stadium cheer. The once imperial streets now smelled of ash, burnt incense, and the lingering aftermath of a banquet gone terribly wrong. Survivors trudged through the debris, their faces plastered with the same expression you get when you realize the Wi-Fi is down, confused, frustrated, and oddly hopeful for a reboot. Galeric, perched atop the Capitoline Hill, surveyed his loot with a half-smile, as if he'd just finished the ultimate reality TV crossover, Rome, the final season. In that bitter quiet, Rome's fall felt less like an end and more like a punchline to a joke the empire had been telling itself for centuries. When the last Roman consul in the West shuffled his toga into the dust of Ravenna, the empire's banner fell like a tired flag in a storm. Barbarian warlords swarmed the broken roads, their swords clanging against the cracked marble, while the smell of rotting feasts lingered in the air. The Senate, once a marble cathedral of debate, became an echo chamber of muttering scribes and broken promises. Villagers watched their villas turn into forts, and the distant sound of a distant legion's drumbeat faded into a melancholy hum. Even the pigeons that once delivered imperial edicts now cooed over piles of shattered amphorae. Yet Rome didn't vanish without leaving a souvenir bag of legacies. Its laws, etched in crisp wax tablets, survived the wreckage and later whispered through the courts of the Franks like an ancient legal meme. The aqueducts, those stone arteries, still dripped cool water into medieval villages, sounding like the sigh of a tired giant. Monumental arches, still standing, cast long shadows at sunset, reminding everyone that the Romans once built things that could outlast their own Wi-Fi signals. Even the smell of baked bread from a Roman bakery resurfaced in the bustling markets of Gaul, a tasty reminder that empire is also about good food. While the West broke into a patchwork of knotted kingdoms, the Eastern Empire, Byzantium, kept its crown polished and its catapults ready. From the glittering walls of Constantinople, candlelight flickered over mosaics that sang of saints and emperors alike, casting colors that smelled faintly of incense and sea salt. The Eastern fleet sliced through the Bosphorus with a confidence that made the Western barbarians look like toddlers wobbling on a tricycle. Their scholars tucked ancient scrolls into leather satchels, humming the same verses that had once floated over the forum, proving that knowledge can be as stubborn as a mule. In short, the East was the empire's Netflix, still streaming, while the West kept buffering. Ghosts of Rome's grandeur now haunt the ruins like cheap holograms at a Renaissance-themed amusement park. You can hear the echo of a triumphant trumpet, then the clatter of a stray goblet shattering on a broken column, an ironic soundtrack for a civilization that once claimed all roads lead to Rome. These spectral whispers caution future leaders. Don't trust a senator who wears gold sneakers, and never schedule a banquet on a day that ends with a meteor strike. The irony is palpable when a modern tourist snaps a selfie in front of the Colosseum, smirking at its past, unaware that the stone beneath their shoes once bore the weight of lions, gladiators, and the occasional misplaced Wi-Fi router. In the end, the ruins grin, knowing they've turned history into the ultimate reality TV drama. So what does this crumbling saga teach the next generation of empire builders, from tech moguls to backyard monarchs? That power without proper plumbing will rust, and that lofty speeches sound hollow when your palace reeks of mildew and burnt offerings. As the ghosts of marble whisper, remember, even the biggest empire can trip over its own sandals. Think of it as the ultimate plot twist. The empire that built the world's first fast food empire also invented the first fast food failure. And somewhere, in a dimly lit lecture hall, a professor will quote this story while playing a clip from Game of Thrones, reminding us that every throne is just a chair waiting for a dramatic exit. The Danube shivered under a sky that looked like an overcooked pancake, and the distant hum of marching legionnaires sounded like a broken accordion. In the waning years of the 4th century, Rome's once glorious banners fluttered like tired laundry on a wind-blown balcony. Citizens in the capital complained that the grain dole tasted more like sand than wheat, while senators argued over who stole the last piece of chocolate cake from the imperial pantry. Meanwhile, the empire's paperwork piled up higher than the Colosseum's ruined arches, each scroll a tiny coffin for a dead idea. It was the perfect backdrop for a story that would soon feel like a Game of Thrones episode filmed on a budget of crumbling stone. Enter Lucius Varro, a veteran whose beard had seen more campaigns than most Instagram influencers have selfies. The Senate, in its infinite wisdom, slotted him onto a mud-slick command post at the Danube frontier, a place where the air smelled of river mold and burnt horseflesh. Varro rode his horse, Asterios, through a thicket of reeds that whispered like gossiping matrons, his sandals clacking against the soggy ground. He surveyed a line of wooden palisades that creaked under the weight of tired centurions, each men's armor stained with the sweat of endless tax collection. With a sigh that could have powered an entire legion, he wondered if the empire's greatest enemy was bureaucracy, not barbarians. On the opposite bank, Alaric the Gothic chieftain lounged on a fallen pine trunk, his eyes glittering like the neon sign of a midnight pizza joint. He wore a leather coat stitched with furs that smelled of pine resin and a hint of wolf urine, nature's cologne for a warlord. Charismatic as a rock star and twice as loud, he greeted Varro with a grin that said, "I'm not here for a friendly cup of tea, but I'll trade you a hostage for a horse if you're feeling generous." Their conversation crackled like firewood, each word a splinter that lodged itself in the other's mind. Between them, the river sang a low, mocking lullaby, as if the water itself were streaming a podcast about impending doom. Back in Rome, the coffers were emptier than a miser's wallet after a Black Friday sale, and taxpayers grumbled louder than a crowd at a gladiator reenactment. The imperial bureaucracy resembled a massive spider web, every strand sticky with red ink, every spider, i.e., clerk, too busy to notice the holes being gnawed by hungry outsiders. In the markets, the scent of spoiled cheese mingled with the acrid smoke of charcoal forges, while soldiers trudged through streets clogged with refuse that squelched under their boots like soggy socks. Officials debated whether to raise taxes or lower the standards for a legion's armor, a decision as pleasant as deciding between a wooden spoon or a rusty fork for dinner. All the while, Varro's reports arrived at the capital dripping with mud, each line a reminder that the empire's veins were clogged with decay. The first diplomatic overture arrived wrapped in a bundle of furs and a half-eaten boar leg, a gift that said, "We come in peace, or at least we're willing to share dinner." Varro, ever the pragmatist, accepted with a chuckle, noting that the empire had been signing treaties with more dubious parties than a reality TV show casting director. He proposed a temporary truce, offering grain in exchange for the Goths' promise to leave the Danube walls untouched, an arrangement as fragile as a glass vase in a thunderstorm. Yet both men sensed the storm gathering beyond the horizon, a thunderhead of migratory tribes that would soon turn the empire's shadows into full-blown night. As the sun set, casting a blood-red glow over the river, the stage was set for the next act. A clash that would echo through history, like a viral meme that refuses to die. Yalaric swaggered through the mist-laden passes of the Balkans, his scarred banner snapping in the cold wind like a punk rocker's guitar pick. He had coaxed rival tribes, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and a few disgruntled Huns, into a single snarling mass that smelled of sweat, unwashed skins, and the faint perfume of pine sap. The road ahead stretched like a ragged carpet, littered with abandoned farmhouses whose thatched roofs sagged under the weight of time. Villagers peered from cracked windows, eyes wide as the glow of a distant fire, while the distant clatter of hooves sounded like a drumline on a war movie soundtrack. Behind them, the Roman frontiers trembled, as if the empire itself were bracing for a bad hair day. General Lucius, chin clenched tighter than a Roman senator's purse strings, rallied his legions on the dusty plain, sword tips gleaming like kitchen knives in the sunrise. The first clash erupted in a cacophony of shield bangs, war cries, and the unmistakable squeal of a wounded horse, basically an ancient version of a heavy metal concert, only with more blood and less tuning. Yet even as his men formed the famed testudo, murmurs of dissent slithered through the ranks, some centurions muttering that the gods had left their helmets at home. Supplies rotted in the wagons, emitting a sour stench that made even the toughest legionary gag like a barmaid after a night of cheap wine. Lucius felt the heat of battle on his back, but the hotter pressure came from a chorus of disgruntled soldiers demanding pay, proving that even in Rome, paycheck to paycheck had ancient roots. The campaign's appetite grew monstrous, feeding on anything the march could swallow, from grain sacks to the unfortunate foot soldier's lunchbox. By the third week, the army's mess tents reeked of moldy cheese and boiled cabbage, a perfume that could knock a gladiator out of the arena with a single whiff. Fields once golden with wheat now lay barren, trampled into mud that stuck to bootlaces like cheap chewing gum. Famine gnawed at the soldiers' bellies, turning their eyes hollow and their jokes into dark humor about swapping bread for a sack of lead. Even the local pigeons looked gaunt, pecking at scraps as if auditioning for a role in a post-apocalyptic sitcom. The Senate, perched high on marble thrones, acted like a lazy reality show panel, voting on war strategy between sips of diluted wine and gossip about who wore the best toga. Corrupt magistrates funneled the empire's gold into private feasts, leaving the front lines to scrape together copper coins that clinked like a broken karaoke machine. When Lucius sent urgent pleas for reinforcements, the Senate replied with a sigh and a promise to consider the matter after the next banquet. Their indifference smacked harder than a Roman sandal on a marble floor, and the legionaries began to wonder if the Senate's idea of defense was simply a clever new form of political yoga, stretching the truth until it broke. In a moment of bitter irony, a senator whispered that the Goths might be just fans of the new indie band, Barbarian Beats, as if a playlist could stop an invading horde. The tension between the marching Goths and the crumbling empire thickened like a stew left on a fire too long, boiling over, sticky, and impossible to stir without splashing. Galaric's war cry echoed across the Danube, a sound that shook the very mosaics of the Senate's hall, reminding everyone that the empire's walls were as porous as a colander. Lucius, now bruised and surrounded by mutinous soldiers, realized he was playing a game of chess with pieces that kept sliding off the board. He ordered a desperate sortie, hoping to catch the Goths off guard, but the scent of burned leather and fear already hung heavy in the air. As the sun set, casting a blood-red glow over the battlefield, both sides understood one truth: Rome's grandeur was fading faster than a meme on a tired internet forum. The Goths thundered across the marshy plains, their war cries mixing with the sickly smell of damp reeds. They circled Aquileia like a pack of wolves eyeing a carcass, tossing braziers that sent ash spiraling into the night sky. The city's stone walls, once polished by centuries of triumph, now glistened with wet moss and the sweat of nervous guards. From the ramparts, Lucius could see the enemy's shields flashing like a sea of iron sardines. The siege had begun, and the air tasted of iron and fear. Inside the battered gate, Lucius barked orders to a garrison thin as a Roman toga on a hot summer day. 15 veteran legionaries clutched their gladii, while a jittery cohort of conscripts shuffled, their armor creaking like an old wooden ship. He tried to spark courage with a half-hearted speech about the glory of Rome that sounded more like a dad joke than a rallying cry. If we fall, at least we'll finally get a break from those endless taxes. Yet the men's eyes flickered, caught between the promise of glory and the stench of rotting meat from the dead. Still, they tightened their shields, ready to hold the line for as long as their dwindling supplies would allow. Meanwhile, in the marble corridors of the Capitol, senators whispered behind curtains, while a nervous messenger sprinted toward Aquileia with conflicting decrees. One edict urged Lucius to hold the city at all costs, while another, from a rival consul, demanded an immediate withdrawal to preserve the legions for a strategic retreat. The paperwork arrived in a courier's satchel that smelled of ink and desperation, making Lucius feel like a character in a badly written sitcom, Rome's finest, now starring in the misguided orders. The irony was thick enough to choke on, as Rome's famed bureaucracy turned battle plans into a game of telephone. Lucius read the scrolls, crumpled them, and tossed them into the fire, where they crackled like gossip at a banquet. Back in Aquileia, the citizens' morale cracked faster than the city's once impermeable walls. Mothers clutched their children, eyes wide as they heard the clang of Gothic hammers beating against stone. Each strike sounded like a drum roll for disaster. The aroma of charred bread from hurried bakeries mingled with the foul odor of sewage overflowed by the siege's engines, making the air taste like a failed feast. When a section of the western wall finally gave way, a cascade of dust fell like confetti at a funeral, and the crowd's sigh echoed the city's own resignation. The crumbling barrier became a grim metaphor, Rome's famed invincibility now reduced to a series of hairline fissures. As night fell, the broken wall cast long shadows that danced over the battlefield, resembling the silhouette of a broken TV antenna, signaling that the Empire's signal was losing reception. Lucius stood amidst the rubble, his armor dented, his beard peppered with ash, feeling like an exhausted gamer stuck on a boss level with a glitchy controller. Yet even as hope thinned, a few stubborn youths sang an old hymn, their voices rising above the groans of the wounded, a reminder that Rome's heart still beat beneath the stone. The siege, with its iron fists and bureaucratic blunders, had turned Aquileia into a microcosm of the Empire's fate, proud, ragged, and oddly funny in its tragic absurdity. In the end, the walls may have cracked, but the story of Rome's collapse would echo louder than any battle cry, reverberating through history like a meme that never dies. The sky over Rome turned a bruised violet as the last light of day slipped behind the Tiber, casting long shadows over marble and mud alike. Alaric's war band, slick with the scent of pine sap and horse sweat, battered the ancient walls like a horde of angry fans at a sold-out concert. The great gates shuddered, their iron ribs groaning under the weight of wooden ladders and relentless fury. From the forum, a street vendor shouted, "Buy a loaf, get a free panic," as terrified citizens scrambled for whatever shelter they could find. When the wooden gates finally gave way, a roar erupted that drowned even the clatter of chariots and market cries. Warriors poured through, their swords dripping with river mud and a dash of last night's wine, slicing banners that once proclaimed eternal glory. The streets flooded with a cacophony of clanging metal, screaming children, and the acrid smell of burning oil that curled like a lazy dragon around the arches. Even the marble statues seemed to flinch, their stone eyes catching the flicker of torchlight as if they too were surprised at the chaos. Somewhere in the distance, a minstrel tried to play a lute, but the tune turned into a mournful dirge as quickly as a Netflix series flips from comedy to tragedy. Amid the pandemonium, Lucius leaned against a shattered column, his crimson tunic stained with his own blood and the city's soot. His leg throbbed like a drumbeat, each pulse reminding him of vows once made to protect the Empire's heart. He watched, half-starved, as the Senate's gold-leafed roof caught fire, sending sparks skyward like fireworks on a bad budget. The sight of the eagle's standards slipping into ash made his heart feel like a wilted laurel, heavy and absurdly defeated. With irony sharp as a Roman gladius, he muttered, "All roads lead to Rome, even the ones paved with betrayal," and wondered if the gods had a binge-watching habit for human downfall. Betrayal slithered through the crowd like a rogue snake, its hiss heard in whispered promises and the clink of silver coins handed to guards for silence. Friends turned foes in an instant. A senator who'd once toasted Lucius now knelt, offering a dagger wrapped in a silk handkerchief. The air tasted of ash, stale wine, and the metallic tang of spilled blood, a cocktail no senator could claim as a vintage. As the last of the imperial standards fell, a collective gasp rippled through the city, echoing off the walls as though the very stones were sighing in disbelief. Even the pigeons, those persistent paparazzi of the ancient world, flapped away in a frantic feathered exodus, abandoning their perch like fans leaving a sold-out arena after the final encore. When the flames finally guttered, Rome lay in a smoldering blanket, its grandeur reduced to a chorus of crackling embers and the scent of charred marble. News of the sack traveled faster than a messenger on a swift horse, reaching the farthest provinces where traders whispered the tale over cups of honeyed wine. Empires beyond the hills raised eyebrows, some laughing nervously as if the world had just been pranked by a mischievous deity. Yet beneath the irony and the distant chuckles, a deep, uneasy shiver spread, recognition that even the mightiest empire could be toppled by a single breach. Lucius, still clutching his wounded leg, stared at the ruined skyline and wondered whether the next chapter would be a sequel or an outright reboot. When the last legions fell back, the streets of Rome smelled of ash, sweat, and a lingering fear that clung like wet wool. Families lugged half-eaten loaves and cracked amphorae, fleeing westward under a sky bruised with smoke. The Tiber, once a glittering ribbon, now churned with debris, and the sour cries of refugees scrambling for a dry place to camp. Even the mighty marble arches seemed to sigh, their shadows stretching like tired stagehands waiting for the final curtain. In the distance, gaunt silhouettes of barbarian war bands flickered, a reminder that the empire's exit was anything but graceful. Alaric, the Goth with a knack for dramatic entrances, crowed atop the ruined Senate like a rock star claiming a backstage pass. He declared a new kingdom, draping his sword with laurel wreaths and handing out decrees in a mix of Latin and a guttural chant that sounded like a medieval rap battle. For a fleeting summer, Rome's forum echoed with the clang of barbarian boots and the smell of fresh pine log fires, as the Goths tried to turn the marble forums into their own version of a tavern. Yet the kingdom wilted as quickly as a summer pop-up shop, because the Romans still clung to their bureaucratic paperwork like toddlers to pacifiers. By autumn, Alaric's banner was tattered, and the Goths vanished into the woods, leaving behind a confused crowd that wondered whether they'd witnessed a revolution or a particularly enthusiastic costume party. The relentless waves of Franks, Vandals, and Huns pounded the already corroded veins of Roman administration, turning tax rolls into soggy scrolls that fell apart when you tried to read them. Provincial governors, once dressed in crisp togas, now shuffled through muddy roads in patched cloaks, muttering about budget cuts as if it were a new curse. Letters from the capital arrived smelling of fermented goat cheese, their seal broken by hungry rats that had taken over the imperial mailrooms. With each invasion, the bureaucratic gears squeaked louder, grinding to a halt as officials fled or were swallowed by a battlefield's cacophony of clashing swords and shouting war cry. In the end, the empire's paperwork became as useless as a chariot without wheels, and the once proud civil service collapsed under the weight of its own rusted ink. As the barbarians settled, they mixed their woolen tunics with Roman sandals, creating a fashion mash-up that would make any runway designer gasp. Pagan chants blended with Latin prayers, turning the basilica's echo into a chorus that sounded like a medieval karaoke night gone wild. Cooking pots clanged together, releasing aromas of roasted boar, spiced wine, and the occasional whiff of a Roman delicacy called garum, a fermented fish sauce that still managed to offend the modern palate. Children grew up reciting both the Aeneid and heroic sagas about thunder god Thor, sketching frescoes that featured a centaur riding a chariot pulled by wolves. This cultural cocktail, thick and bubbling like a cauldron, proved that even as empires crumble, the human spirit can spin a new tapestry from the shredded threads of old glory. When the last Roman banner finally slipped into the mud, the continent stared at a landscape that felt like a Game of Thrones episode filmed on a budget. The shattered marble turned into stone foundations for humble wooden halls, and the clamor of swords replaced the soft murmur of senatorial debates. Feudal lords rose like seedlings from the ruins, each claiming a plot of land with a handshake and a blood oath rather than a polished decree. Yet the echo of Rome's broken empire lingered in every monastery's library, in the lingering taste of old laws whispered over candlelight, reminding everyone that history never truly dies, it just gets a new costume. And so, from the ashes of the eternal city, the medieval world took its first breath, a gritty, glorious sequel that would keep storytellers busy for the next 1,000 years. The sun drapes a golden haze over the marble bones of the Forum, and the clatter of sandal-shod traders ricochets off the vaulted arches. In the midst of the bustle, Lucius the grain merchant hustles his sack of barley, his hands stained with the earthy scent of wheat and the faint perfume of a nearby baker's fire. Across the stone, Senator Gaius adjusts his toga with a flourish, his laurel-crowned ambition shimmering like a bad haircut in a modern superhero movie. The crowd swirls around them, a kaleidoscope of plebeians, soldiers, and gossip-monger women, each voice adding another layer to the Forum's ever-growing hum. Together, they stand under the shadow of the rostra, oblivious to the first tremors of a crisis that will soon turn marble into sand. By midday, a shouted proclamation rattles the columned walls. The imperial treasury has raised the tributum, the tax on grain, by another 5%. Lucius feels his coin purse sputter as the newly minted denarii, as thin as a paper slice of prosciutto, clink hollowly against each other. The debasement of the currency spreads a metallic tang through the air, like the smell of a blacksmith's forge after a night of overcooking sausages. Vendors mutter about the emperor's new money-making scheme, while the scent of cheap wine mingles with the sweat of laboring backs, creating a perfume no one would willingly wear. As the crowd swallows the news, the Forum's marble floor seems to tremble under the weight of a growing unease. In the shade of a basilica, Gaius meets a discreet messenger who slides a leather-bound sack of copper coins across the table with the smoothness of a Netflix binge. The bribe glints like a cheat code for power, and Gaius's eyes flicker with the same hungry gleam that lights a gamer's screen when they unlock a rare achievement. He whispers promises of favorable edicts, while the whispers themselves echo like rusted chains rattling through the marble corridors. Around them, senators gossip about the emperor's favorite and the grain shortage, their words dripping with irony as thick as the sludge that collects in the Forum's drains after a rainstorm. The corrupt dance between money and law spins faster, casting long shadows that stretch across the very statues of Rome's founding fathers. The city's sanitation workers haul away a heap of rotting olives and spilled wine, the stench rising like a bad plot twist in a soap opera that no one asked for. Lucius, wiping his brows with a discarded scroll, chuckles that even the gods must be watching this drama unfold like a binge-worthy series of Game of Thrones, except with fewer dragons and more legionnaires. Gaius, meanwhile, adjusts his cufflinks, tiny bronze figs, and muses that the empire's stability feels as fragile as a TikTok trend, fast, flashy, and doomed to crash. A stray cat darts between columns, scattering a few stray copper pennies that clatter like applause from an invisible audience of disgruntled citizens. The irony is palpable. While the elite sip diluted wine, the common folk snack on stale bread, each bite tasting like a reminder that even the mighty can be humbled by a bad fiscal policy. As evening paints the sky with bruised purples, the forum's lanterns flicker, casting wavering shadows that crawl over the triumphal arches like sneaky paparazzi. Lucius locks his stall, the smell of night air mingling with the distant clang of a forge and the faint perfume of incense from a nearby temple. Gaius retreats to his marble office, the echo of his own footsteps a metronome to the rising panic that even the Senate cannot silence. The murmur of discontent swells, a low hum that hints at rebellion, yet the marble faces above seem to stare on, indifferent, as if frozen in a selfie taken centuries ago. In that twilight, the forum stands caught between opulent grandeur and the creeping rot of greed, a stage where the shadows over the forum are not just darkness, but the very prelude to Rome's next act. When the Egyptian sun finally slammed the fields, the wheat stalks drooped like wilted hair on a Roman centurion after a night of wine. A pestilence of grain-eating locusts swooped in, leaving behind a carpet of husks that smelled like damp parchment and regret. The granaries in Alexandria gaped open, echoing the hollow hush of an empty pantry, and traders whispered that even the Nile seemed to have taken a vacation. News of the failed harvest sprinted to Rome faster than a chariot on a downhill slope, striking the city's belly with the force of a bad comedy punchline. Soon the forum buzzed with rumors and the smell of stale barley, signaling that the empire's next crisis would be measured not in legions, but in empty stomachs. Lucius, a streetwise merchant with more scar tissue than a gladiator, slipped into the shadowed alleys where the black market hummed like a busted oil lamp. He bartered for sacks of half-roasted grain, the air thick with the acrid perfume of sweat, cheap wine, and the faint metallic tang of bribes. Every official he met, senators with togas as crisp as fresh bills and scribes with lecherous smiles, demanded a kickback that tasted like burnt incense and disappointment. One pompous procurator even tried to extort Lucius by demanding a goat and a scroll of poetry, which made the merchant laugh as hard as a drunk Roman at a poetry slam. Dodging these greedy hands, Lucius learned to hide the grain in a hollowed-out lyre, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like the theme from The Fast and the Furious, but with more sandal straps. Meanwhile, Gaius, a senator with a silver tongue polished brighter than a centurion's shield, strutted into the Senate like a reality TV host swaggering onto a stage. He spun a tale that the grain shortage was merely a temporary glitch, akin to a server lag in the grand game of empire, and promised exclusive contracts that would fill the granaries and his own pocket. With a wink, he tossed a handful of figs to a few junior magistrates, a gesture that smelled like cheap perfume and political ambition. The Senate, sipping diluted wine, voted faster than a binge-watch marathon, handing Gaius the right to buy grain at government rates, a phrase that means paying double for half the quality. In the end, his machinations turned the grain market into a Vegas-style casino, where the house always won, and the populace watched the chips melt like snow in the forum's marble fountains. The plebs gathered around cracked stone steps, clutched empty bowls that rattled like dead drums at a carnival, their faces smudged with the grime of hunger. Children wailed for stale porridge, while the scent of rotting grain drifted from the sewers, a perfume more pungent than a Roman latrine after a feast. At the same time, the elite reclined on marble benches, feasting on stuffed pheasants and sipping honeyed wine, their laughter echoing like a sitcom laugh track in a palace. The stark divide turned the city into a living tableau of irony. The rich toasted to abundance while the poor panted like exhausted gladiators after a bout with a lion. Even the street performers began to mock the situation, juggling empty amphorae and shouting, "May the odds be ever in your favor," a cheeky nod to a far future movie about survival games. As the last grain sack vanished into a private cellar, the empire's foundations shivered like a Roman wall under a hurricane of gossip and resentment. Lucius watched the elite's doors close, hearing the soft thud of their gold-lined shutters, while the plebs' protests rose like a chorus of angry cicadas. Gaius, now draped in the spoils of his own scheme, strutted through the Senate garden, oblivious to the fact that even his triumph tasted of ash. The city's future began to look as bleak as a desert night, with only the faint glow of rebellion flickering like a candle in a dark tavern. In the end, the grain shortage became the empire's most brutal reality show, proving that when the pantry empties, even the mightiest emperors can feel as powerless as a newborn chick in a lion's den. The marble Senate chamber thrummed like a giant amphitheater, sunlight slapping dust off the vaulted arches, while the scent of cheap wine and stale politics hung heavy in the air. Rival senators huddled in shadowed corners, whispering conspiracies that would make even a modern reality show jealous. Their target, Gaius, whose pockets were deeper than the Tiber, and whose corruption seeped into the grain warehouses like a slow-spreading mold. Citizens complained of empty granaries, the sour stench of rotting wheat wafting from the market like a warning bell. Even the marble seemed to sigh, as if the very stones were aware they were just set pieces in a tragic comedy. Secret alliances blossomed like forbidden romances in a Roman sitcom, each handshake a silent punchline that only the schemers could hear. Marcia, the senator with a smile as polished as a bronze armor, slipped a sealed scroll to her cousin Flaccus behind a tapestry embroidered with mythic beasts. Their plan unfolded with the subtlety of a legion marching into a tavern, loud, inevitable, and strangely entertaining. The conspirators exchanged silver nuggets that clinked like coins from a video game loot chest, a wink to the gods of profit. In the background, the echo of a lyre played a tune so jaunty, it could have been the soundtrack of a Netflix binge watch. Unwittingly, Lucius found himself caught in the middle, his dwindling supplies turning him into a human bargaining chip. The granaries he tended reeked of sour barley and damp stone, each breath a reminder that famine was just a whisper away. A smooth-tongued envoy approached him, offering a partnership that smelled of olive oil and intrigue, promising grain in exchange for political favors. Lucius, hopeful and naive, thought he was merely swapping sacks of wheat for a few extra soldiers, not realizing he was stepping onto a stage where every grain could tip the scales of power. The weight of the sack in his hands felt like the weight of a Senate decree, heavy and impossible to ignore. Outside, the forum roared with public outrage, vendors shouting over the clamor of angry crowds, while fish stalls emitted a briny stench that clung to the hot summer air. Gaius sweated beneath his toga like a CEO under a Senate subpoena, his brow dripping with the same sweat that dripped from a gladiator's brow after a bout. Hidden machinations shifted behind the scenes, gears turning in the dark like a covert engine of a steampunk airship. The Senate itself resembled the backstage of a rock concert, lights dimming as power plays took center stage, and the audience, Rome's citizens, demanded an encore of justice. Ironically, the only thing louder than the conspirators' whispers was the clamor of Rome's hungry stomachs. When the hidden ledger was finally unrolled, the numbers glowed like a neon sign announcing Gaius's greed to the entire empire. The conspirators prepared to wield Lucius's grain as leverage, promising a feast for the masses if Gaius fell, a culinary coup that would make even the gods raise an eyebrow. The chapter closed on a cliffhanger, Gaius staring at the open scroll as if it were a cursed scroll from a cursed TikTok video scrolling endlessly. Even the deities seemed to scroll through the drama, scrolling their celestial feeds, chuckling at mortal folly. With the Senate's intrigue sharpening like a gladius, Rome's decay and corruption poised themselves for the next, even darker act. The streets of Rome stink of sweat, stale honey wine, and the sour tang of unpaid wages. Vendors shout over clattering carts, their cries drowned by the clamor of restless citizens marching like ants from the Forum to the Subura. The imperial coffers are as empty as a gladiator's helmet after a night of wild revelry, and every cracked wall seems to whisper of a dying empire. Even the marble statues look jaundiced, as if the very stone were nauseated by the city's rot. When the ruthless tax collector Gnaeus Maximus was found slain, his blood splattered across the marble steps like a spilled latte at a hipster coffee shop, unexpected, messy, and oddly satisfying to the onlookers. Rumors spread faster than gossip about a new reality show, each version more lurid than the last, and the crowds roared louder than a theater audience at a plot twist. Lanterns flickered, casting trembling shadows that danced over the graffiti-etched pleas, justice, or at least a refund. The scent of burnt incense mixed with the metallic tang of fear, igniting a spark that threatened to blaze across the city. Lucius, a lanky scribe with ink-stained fingers, shoved his way into the angry tide, his heart pounding like a drumline at a Roman rave. He hoisted a makeshift banner, essentially a ripped toga with the words "No more taxes," scrawled in shaky charcoal, and shouted, "We're not buying your jokes, Maximus." The crowd's chant rose in a cacophony of grunts, claps, and the occasional squeak of a stray rooster that had somehow joined the revolt. The air tasted of hot ash and cheap perfume, a reminder that rebellion is never clean, but always oddly fragrant. Meanwhile, Gaius, the senatorial lion-hearted but perpetually nervous overseer, found himself cornered by allies who suddenly remembered the meaning of loyalty, like friends who bail on a movie night when the plot gets too dark. His trial erupted in the Curia, where marble benches creaked under the weight of whispered accusations, and the occasional snort of a bored senator scrolling through a wax tablet like a medieval Instagram feed. Every word hurled at him sounded like a stone tossed into a quiet pond, rippling through the chambers and shaking the ornate mosaics. Gaius felt the sweat of his own deception drip into his toga, soaking the sandaled feet of his former comrades. The verdict hung in the air like a half-cooked soufflé, volatile and ready to collapse at any sudden gust. As the magistrates delivered their decision, a collective sigh rose from the crowd, half relief, half dread, like the sound of 1,000 tired sighs after a binge-watch marathon. Rome's fragile balance, already wobbling like a drunken juggler, teetered on the edge of a new order, where the plebs might finally have a say beyond shouting at statues. In the end, even the gods seemed to chuckle, their thunder echoing like a distant bass drop, reminding everyone that power is as fickle as a Roman's love for extra garum on their fish. The Forum, once a glittering arena of merchants' cries, now reeks of stale wine and mildew-soaked scrolls, as if the market had caught a bad case of the flu. Vendors lug cracked amphorae over cracked pavement, their wares dried figs, half-rotten olives, sweating under a sun that feels more like a cheap studio light. Coins clink like an old arcade game when tossed into a beggar's cup, barely enough to buy a loaf of sour barley. Even the statues seem to sag, their marble faces eroded by the relentless drizzle of neglect, and the distant clang of a broken aqueduct echoes like a busted bass line. The city's pulse has slowed to a wheezing cough, a warning sign flashing, system overload in ancient Latin. Up on the Capitoline Hill, the Senate drags its togas across marble steps that have seen better days, each creak a sigh of fading authority. Senators whisper in corridors scented with wax and old parchment, their debates sounding more like reality TV arguments than legislative sessions. One dignitary, a man with a beard as thin as a Wi-Fi signal, mutters about fiscal reforms while his pocket runs empty, a glaring irony that would make even a modern politician blush. The once proud curule chair sits lopsided, as if the very seat is tired of supporting empty rhetoric, and the echo of their empty promises drifts down like cheap incense. Outside, the populace watches the glittering Senate's glow flicker like a dying neon sign, the lights of power dimming faster than a smartphone battery at a festival. Gaius, the once proud centurion with medals that now look like busted star stickers, is led away on a wooden cart that squeaks louder than a squeaky floorboard in a haunted house. His exile route snakes past trash-strewn alleys where the smell of rotting cheese battles the scent of fresh ash from the recent fire at the bakery, an olfactory reminder that even fire can't cleanse corruption. He glances back at the city, seeing the Senate's bronze doors creak open to reveal a landscape of cracked tiles and graffiti that reads, "No more taxes," in hurried charcoal. As the sea breezes whisper, Gaius chuckles bitterly, recalling the emperor's promise of glory that felt as hollow as a broken lute. The horizon stretches like a Netflix "Are you still watching?" screen, prompting him to wonder if destiny is just another binge-watchable tragedy. Back in the heart of the market, Lucius sets up his modest stall, a patchwork of weathered canvas and dented copper pots, each clanging like a percussionist practicing for a Roman rave. He arranges humble wares, dry figs, cracked dates, a jug of sour wine that smells like vinegar and disappointment, while a stray dog sniffs at his boots, its belly rumbling louder than the distant chariot wheels. The crowd drifts by, eyes glazed from years of famine-fueled fatigue, yet they pause for a moment to barter a bronze coin for a handful of olives, a transaction as rare as a perfect meme. Lucius, with a grin as crooked as the empire's morals, jokes that his stall is now the epicenter of economic revival, a title that would make a modern influencer roll their eyes. The air buzzes with the hiss of a nearby fire, the crackle reminding everyone that even the smallest flame can scorch the lies that have long held the city together. As twilight settles, the city's silhouette shivers against the ash-gray sky, a battered superhero costume torn at the seams. The lingering scent of burnt timber mixes with the sour tang of unpaid taxes, forming a perfume the Romans might have called inevitable decline. The narrator, with a wry chuckle, compares Rome's corruption to a badly coded video game where the cheat codes have been leaked to everyone, nothing works, and the boss level is forever unreachable. Yet within the gloom, a single candle flickers in Lucius's stall, its glow a stubborn reminder that even in an empire drowning in its own greed, ordinary hands can still spark a brief, stubborn light. The chapter closes on that candle, a lone beacon that says, "We may have lost the war, but the after-credits scene is still being written," leaving the audience with a somber, yet oddly hopeful shrug. When the last king, Tarquin the Proud, was dragged off the Palatine Hill, the air tasted like a mix of triumph and goat cheese. The crowd's cheers clanged against the marble steps, while the Senate's empty chairs waited like a fresh pizza box. Romans, still sticky with sweat from the street brawl, stared at a new dawn where no single crown would ever again sit on their heads. It felt like the moment a video game finally let you skip the tutorial and start the real quest. The Senate, a half-grown oak of 30-odd elders, rose like a reluctant chorus line, each man clutching a roll of parchment as if it were a Netflix remote. They fashioned a system of checks and balances, a polite tug of war where no one could hog the remote control of the state. Every debate echoed with the clang of bronze swords and the occasional wheeze of a senatorial cough, reminding everyone that politics was as messy as the market stalls. Ironically, the very people who claimed to hate kings ended up playing king-like games with their own rules. At the helm rode two consuls, twin captains of the Roman ship, each wearing a laurel wreath that smelled faintly of rosemary and ambition. They swapped duties like alternating DJs at a rave, one day shouting orders from the forum, the next day supervising the grain dole while trying not to trip over a stray sandal. Their authority was limited to a single year. Think of it as a one-season TV series, no renewals unless the audience, the people, demanded it. The clink of their sandals on the stone streets was the soundtrack of accountability, a reminder that power in Rome was a hot potato you couldn't keep forever. Civic virtue, this lofty Roman version of team spirit, binds patricians in silk to plebeians in wool like an awkward but heartfelt group hug at a high school pep rally. Citizens swear oaths that smell of fresh earth after a rainstorm, promising to defend the Republic even if it means sharing a cramped bathtub with a rival family. The Senate tries to teach everyone the art of virtus, not to be confused with video game virtues, a mix of bravery, discipline, and occasional wine-induced karaoke. The result, a gritty, sometimes sour, but unstoppable chorus of voices chanting Roma Vincit, while the city's bakers toss free bread into the crowd. With these foundations laid, Rome looks poised to stretch its arms across the Italian peninsula like a kid reaching for the last slice of pizza. The smell of fresh conquest mingles with the lingering scent of burnt incense from the old temples, a reminder that old gods still watch the new games. Yet even as the Republic struts in its new outfit, a cynical street vendor whispers that power, like a stubborn stain, always finds a way to seep through the seams. Little do they know, this sturdy scaffolding will later support an empire so massive that future Romans will compare it to a blockbuster franchise, except with more sandals and fewer special effects. The restless plains of Italy throbbed with the clang of iron and the chatter of markets as Rome stretched its tendrils farther than the Tiber would allow. Farmers huddled over smoky hearths, gossiping about the newest legion marching out, its standards flashing like neon signs against the amber sky. In the Senate, whispers grew louder. Why stop at the peninsula when the world beyond smelled of conquest? The buzz of ambition was as thick as the scent of fresh figs in the forum, sweet but overripe. Little did they know, the storm brewing on the horizon would not be a gentle breeze, but a full-blown tempest of war. When Carthage answered Rome's call, the Punic Wars erupted like a gladiator match gone viral on ancient social media. Hannibal, that charismatic Carthaginian commander, scooted over the Alps with a menagerie of elephants that looked like oversized, angry elephants in a rock concert video. Roman legions, disciplined as a marching band, clashed with the screech of swords and the stench of burnt leather, blood mingling with the mud of Canna. Citizens back home cheered, their mouths full of wine, while the dead piled up like an unfunny punchline to a joke no one wanted to hear. By the end, Rome's triumph felt as hollow as a triumphal arch after a marathon of endless victory parades. Back in the city, the Gracchi brothers tried to rewrite the script of Roman inequality, handing out land like a reality show host handing out cash prizes. Their reforms smelled of fresh hope, but also of 1,000 angry senators clutching their togas tighter, fearing the loss of their cushy vineyards. Tiber River's waters turned a murky brown, mirroring the political mud that seeped into every marble column. The brothers' passionate speeches rang out, echoing off the Senate walls like a bad karaoke night. Some sang along, most just yelled off-key. Yet their premature deaths turned reform into a cautionary tale, as if Rome had just watched its favorite hero get deleted from the leaderboard. Meanwhile, the social war blasted open the door for Rome's restless Italian allies, who demanded citizenship with a ferocity that could shame a Netflix drama climax. Battles raged in pine forests where the air tasted of pine sap and sweat, and the clamor of shields clanged like a broken drum set. Roman soldiers found themselves fighting brothers-in-arms who once shared wine at the local tavern, now turned foes by a law scribbled on a scroll. The smell of charred armor and fresh blood hung heavy, making even the bravest centurion contemplate a career in pottery instead. When the war finally fizzled, the new citizens were grudgingly welcomed, but the victory felt as bittersweet as a chocolate-covered espresso that left a lingering aftertaste of regret. All these storms of conflict twisted Rome's fate into a tangled web of personal ambition, where leaders began to eye power like teenagers eyeing the newest gaming console. Caesar, a charismatic player with a penchant for dramatic entrances, would later treat the Republic like his personal stage, complete with spotlighted speeches and a soundtrack of marching boots. The city's streets still smelled of incense, blood, and roasted pork, reminders that glory and gore walked hand in hand. As the Republic's marble pillars crumbled, the empire rose, not on the backs of noble ideas, but on the sweaty, mud-splattered boots of men who wanted more than just a seat at the table. And so the storm didn't end. It simply changed its soundtrack, from the clashing of swords to the whir of imperial ambition. When a young Julius Caesar strutted into the forum, he smelled of sandalwood and ambition, his grin brighter than a street lamp in a Roman night. He dazzled the masses with speeches that crackled like fireworks, promising land for the poor and a raise in wine rations for the legionaries. By 60 BC, he'd sealed the first triumvirate, a three-way power smoothie of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, mixing wealth, muscle, and political charm into a potent cocktail. The trio toasted their pact over garum-spiced feasts while the Senate muttered that the Republic was now a reality TV show. Then, with a dramatic flourish, Caesar crossed the Rubicon, letting his army's sandals splash into the Tiber's muddy churn, shouting, "The die is cast," as if announcing the first season of a scandalous drama. Rome's streets erupted in clamor, swords clanged like cheap cymbals, and angry crowds sang curses that smelled of sweat and spilled wine. Caesar's legions marched like a horde of thunderbolts, crushing opposition under a tide of iron and sandaled feet. By 44 BC, he crowned himself dictator for life, draping his toga with the confidence of a modern superhero landing on a rooftop. Yet power's perfume turned sour. A group of senators, looking like disgruntled office workers after a bad coffee, stabbed him 30 times in the Curia Julia, their blades singing a grim lullaby. The blood soaked into the marble, and the scent of copper lingered long after the cheering faded, leaving Rome trembling in a post-heroic hangover. The vacuum left by Caesar's death roared louder than a Colosseum crowd. Conspirators whispered in shadowed villas, while the city's alleys echoed with frantic gossip. Into this chaos stepped the second triumvirate, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, each wielding a half-finished map of the empire like a teenage gamer clutching a broken controller. They forged the infamous proscriptions, posting lists of enemies on public walls that smelled of ash and fear, while their soldiers marched through streets littered with torn banners and half-eaten figs. Money flowed like river wine at a banquet, bribing officials and buying loyalty with the scent of fresh coin. Yet, behind the polished speeches, rivalries simmered, as bitter as the olives left to wilt in the sun, setting the stage for a showdown that would make any reality show finale look tame. Antony, ever the drama king, partnered with Cleopatra, whose perfume of lotus and incense could charm even the most stubborn centurion. They sailed to Egypt, their fleet glittering like a sequined spaceship, and whispered sweet political promises over candle-lit banquets. Octavian, meanwhile, sharpened his sword in the quiet of Italy's hills, his troops marching in perfect rhythm, their sandals kicking up dust that smelled like iron and ambition. The two forces collided at Actium, a massive naval clash where the sea roared like a beast, and the air was thick with the salty sting of blood and sweat. As Cleopatra's ships fled in a panic, Antony's men shouted a mournful chorus, and the tide turned, literally, leaving Octavian standing on a quiet shore, the victor's laurels glinting under a sky that smelled of victory and a hint of ozone. With the Eastern power crushed, Octavian slipped into the Senate, not as a conqueror, but as the empire's new CEO, handing out reforms like party favors at a Roman rave. He renamed himself Augustus, a title smoother than silk, and draped Rome in a calm that smelled of fresh marble and newly planted laurels. The Republic's chaotic chorus faded, replaced by a single, steady drumbeat that echoed through forums and bathhouses alike. Citizens breathed a collective sigh, the clamor of civil war replaced by the gentle rustle of togas and the occasional rumor of imperial gossip. Thus, the turning tide that once threatened to drown Rome instead carried it into a new era, where one ruler held the reins, and the empire marched onward with the swagger of a Hollywood blockbuster finale. When the dust settled over the Rubicon, a weary Octavian stepped onto the Palatine like a reluctant rock star taking the stage after a mutiny. He draped himself in the simple toga of a private citizen, yet his eyes glittered with the ambition of a man who had just outlasted Julius's ghost. The crowd in the forum heard his voice echo over the marble, a mix of triumph and a hint of olive oil-scented sweat. With a shrug to the Senate, he accepted the title Augustus, as if naming himself the one who's finally got his act together. The streets smelled of fresh bread and lingering incense, masking the steel of swords being sheathed for good. Augustus set about turning the Republic's busted machinery into a gleaming imperial engine, all while keeping the Senate's golden veneer polished. He kept the senatorial benches, letting the old aristocrats argue over grain subsidies like kids squabbling over the last slice of pizza. Behind the curtains, however, he nudged the tribunals, the consulships, and the very notion of shared power into his own backstage. Citizens watched the marble statues of Cato and Cicero stare down at a crowd that now heard the roar of legions marching to distant drums. It was a delicate dance, half showmanship, half realpolitik, where every decree smelled faintly of triumph and a little bit of bureaucratic perfume. Under the Pax Romana, the empire stretched like a golden tapestry, the threads of roads humming with carts full of figs, amber, and gossip. Soldiers marched in perfect cadence across the Alps, their sandals kicking up dust that glittered like powdered sugar under the Mediterranean sun. Markets in Alexandria burst with the clamor of merchants hawking papyrus scrolls, while in Britain the wind carried the salty scent of sea foam and freshly cut wool. The empire's pulse beat steady, a symphony of triumph that made even the most stoic centurion grin like a kid at a chariot race finale. Yet, tucked into the corners of triumph, the smell of stale wine and rotting flesh hinted that not everything was polished to marble perfection. As power concentrated in Augustus's padded chair, the once vibrant civic virtues began to wilt like vines left too long in the sun. Citizens, once eager to don the mantle of public service, now lounged in lavish villas, letting their slaves sweep the crumbs from their plates while they sipped mulsum, honey-sweetened wine, with a sigh of indifference. The Senate, that ancient council of debates, grew into a theatrical prop, its speeches echoing off walls that no longer cared for honest counsel. Corruption seeped into the marble pores, and the city's alleys filled with the stench of garbage, blood, and the bitter aftertaste of broken promises. Even the gods seemed to roll their stone eyes, as if saying, "Seriously, we gave you aqueducts, you can't even keep your morals clean." By the time the sun set on Augustus's reign, Rome resembled a blockbuster sequel, glittering special effects, endless sequels, and a plot that kept forgetting who the heroes were. The empire's might became a Netflix binge. Everyone tuned in for the epic battles, but the underlying story grew increasingly about power plays and backstage drama. The people whispered jokes comparing the Senate to a reality TV jury, and the legions to over-enthusiastic fans at a Comic-Con cosplay contest. Yet beneath the humor, a cold wind from the Danube whispered that the empire's golden age was as fragile as a glass goblet at a drunken banquet. In that twilight, Rome stood at the edge of a cliff, its once proud banners fluttering like a tired cape, waiting for the inevitable curtain call. The 3rd century arrived like a weary merchant with an empty sack, its coinage clinking with too little silver. Inflation roared through the streets of Rome, turning a loaf of wheat into a luxury that smelled of sweat and ash. Farmers watched their fields turn to dust, while tax collectors cheered each new levy like a circus barker's shout. Even the Senate, once proud as a marble statue, now looked like a sun-bleached toga draped over a broken chair. Beyond the empire's edges, legions stretched thin like rubber bands about to snap, marching from the scorching sands of the Sahara to the icy mist of the Danube. Soldiers squinted at barbarians wielding iron that gleamed brighter than any Roman gladius, and the clang of steel became a nightly lullaby. Usurpers popped up like weeds after a rainstorm, each promising a fresh batch of coin, while the troops muttered about another quartermaster's mistake. The smell of burnt leather and unwashed backs turned the frontier camps into permanent perfume factories of misery. Back in the marble-capped capital, emperors rose and fell faster than a tick-tock trend, each trying to outlast the last with a new title and a sharper tongue. The year of the 6 emperors turned the throne into a revolving door, and courtiers whispered conspiracies while sipping wine that tasted of iron and regret. Political factions fractured like a cracked amphora, each piece jagged and ready to cut anyone who dared pick it up. In the shadowed halls, the echo of a senator's sigh sounded like a distant thunder, signaling that Rome's once steady heart now hammered irregularly. When Diocletian finally stepped onto the scene, he sliced the empire in half like a master chef carving a roast, handing the east to a sun-loving Caesar and the west to a storm-yoked counterpart. The new borders glittered on maps, yet the people still smelled the same street vendor stew and heard the same clamor of market stalls. Law codes, polished like fresh armor, traveled across both halves, ensuring that a Roman citizen in Alexandria could still argue over property rights with the same gusto as one in Gaul. Even as the western half began to crumble like a sandcastle under a tide of Goths, the eastern sunrise kept the flame of Roman culture flickering. And so the giant fell, but its echo ricochets through time like a bass drop in a modern soundtrack, still reverberating in courts, languages, and even in the occasional et tu, brute meme. The ruins of the Forum smell of rain on broken stone, but they also carry the faint perfume of triumph and tragedy intertwined. Scholars today trace the ghost of Roman law like detectives following a trail of parchment crumbs, marveling at its stubborn persistence. In the grand theater of history, Rome may have exited stage left, yet the spotlight never truly dims on its legacy, much like a binge-watchable series that keeps getting renewed.